December 17, 1944. The Ardennes, Belgium. The fog came before the gunfire. It had been settling for days across the low forest hills of southeastern Belgium. A gray curtain that swallowed roads, blurred tree lanes, erased the distances between the living and the dead. The temperature held just above freezing, the kind of cold that did not announce itself in sharp bursts but simply settled into the bones and stayed there, patient, indifferent, permanent. The fields were mottled with the last remnants of early snow, still white in the hollows, where the sun never reached, but trampled brown and gray everywhere men and machines had passed. Pine boughs sagged. Car tracks had turned to iron ruts overnight. The countryside had the look and feel of something that had given up. From the east, across those fog-bound forests, there came a sound that the Ardennes had not heard in 4 years. A sound of machinery, of iron and diesel, of hundreds of thousands of tons of German ambition grinding westward through the pre-dawn dark. It was the morning of December 16, 1944, and Adolf Hitler had launched his last great gamble in the West, a massive armored assault through the one stretch of Allied line he had calculated was thin, tired, and unprepared. He called it Wacht am Rhein. History would call it the Battle of the Bulge. The men who lived and died inside it would simply call it the worst thing they ever saw. By the morning of December 17th, the spearhead of Hitler's offensive was moving north and west of the Ardennes at a pace that left American commanders struggling to understand what they were even facing. The leading formation of the 6th Panzer Army, Kampfgruppe, named for its commander, SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper, was slashing through the Belgian forest roads like a steel blade. 117 tanks, 149 armored personnel carriers, 24 artillery pieces, more than 4,000 men, all of them carrying the weight of the Third Reich's name, members of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, the Führer's Own Guard unit, whose very identity had been built on the idea that they were something more than soldiers. They were, in their own minds, the embodiment of the new order, the cutting edge of a civilization that believed some men were made to command the earth, and others were made to disappear from it. Paper himself was 30 years old. He had been Heinrich Himmler's personal adjutant. He had fought in France, in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, in Italy. He had been decorated with the Knight's Cross, with the oak leaves. He was, by all accounts of both allies and enemies, a brilliant battlefield commander. He was also, as events would shortly prove, a man who had carried with him from the Eastern Front a particular education, one that made the killing of prisoners not a moral failure, but a tactical convenience. The Eastern Front had a way of doing that to men. It stripped away the scaffolding of civilization and left behind something harder, colder, and far more efficient. On the morning of December 17th, Paper was behind schedule, more than 12 hours behind the timetable Hitler had set. The directive to reach Antwerp within 4 days, a timeline even his own generals considered impossible. He was furious, in the way that men of absolute certainty become furious when reality refuses to cooperate with their certainties. He drove his column hard, burning through Belgian villages, bypassing American resistance rather than stopping to neutralize it, racing for the Meuse River crossing that would open the road west. And then, at approximately 12:45 in the afternoon, just outside the hamlet of Bognes, a crossroads where 5 roads met in a cluster of farms and a roadside cafe called the Café Baudarway, fate arranged an encounter that would take 15 minutes to execute and a lifetime to survive. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion had left Schevenhut, Germany, at 8 o'clock that morning. 30 vehicles, jeeps, weapons carriers, 2.5-ton trucks, approximately 140 men, most of them not frontline infantry, but artillery observers, men trained to locate the source of enemy guns, to call in coordinates, to read the geometry of distant destruction. They were moving south on Route N23, following their orders, following their assigned route, carrying with them all the ordinary equipment of American soldiers in the field, their weapons, their gear, and, tucked into pockets and kit bags, the small accumulations of personal life that soldiers everywhere carry as talismans against mortality. Letters from home, photographs, and cigarettes. Almost always cigarettes. When Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin, commanding the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion in Malmedy, had stopped the lead jeep at the east end of town and warned them not to proceed south, warning them that a German armored column had been spotted in that direction. The officers of Battery B had declined. They had their orders. They had a route. They had, somewhere farther down that road, 2 of their own men waiting to be picked up. It is the nature of orders in war that they sometimes become the instrument of catastrophe. The Battery B convoy reached the Bognez crossroads at approximately 12:45. The sky overhead was opaque, gray-white, offering nothing. The temperature hovered around 0 Celsius. On the road ahead, barely 800 yards to the east, the point tanks of Kampfgruppe paper were swinging north onto the N-32. The lead SS tank commander saw the American convoy moving south. It was, in the language of armored warfare, an inviting target. He opened fire. The first shells hit the lead vehicles of Battery B with a sound that survivors would later describe not as an explosion, but as a concussion, a wall of force that arrived before the sound could catch up with it. Men dove into the roadside ditches. Vehicles swerved, crashed, burned. The convoy dissolved in seconds from a column of purpose into a scatter of survival. Those at the front ran. Those in the middle scrambled for the ditches. Those at the rear heard the firing and turned around before it was too late. In the front jeep, Lieutenant Virgil Laurie and Captain Roger Mills faced a choice that had no good answer. The Germans, now controlling the crossroads, were motioning the survivors in the ditches to stand and march. Some ran toward the treeline to the west. 5 or 6 made it. The rest raised their hands. One of those with his hands in the air was Sergeant Henry Roy Zack of Burnett County, Wisconsin. He was a reconnaissance man, 3rd in command of his platoon from the 32nd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division, who had come to the crossroads that morning on what his lieutenant had described as a secret mission, counting German vehicles through a narrow gap in the Siegfried Line. He had eaten breakfast early. He had traveled through the fog with 4 jeeps and 11 men, doing his job, following his training, trusting in the order of things the way soldiers are trained to trust in order. And now he stood in a muddy field south of the Café Beaudarway at Bognez, with his hands raised, in the company of approximately 100 American prisoners, watching Kampfgruppe paper's armored column roll past in an unbroken river of steel. The prisoners were searched. Everything of value was taken: watches, rings, money, and cigarettes. The small, white paper tubes that an American soldier was never without, issued by the government. A daily provision as regular as rations, as dependable as the morning mail. They were taken by German hands, with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to taking things. They disappeared into pockets, into the indifferent machinery of conquest. The cigarettes were gone, and with them went, for a moment, the last small warmth of the ordinary world. By approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 113 American prisoners were assembled in the field immediately south of the Café Beaudarway. Not all of them were from Battery B. Sergeant Zack was there. Men from 5 ambulances were there. Men from other scattered units, caught by the same armored wave, were there. They stood in the field in their olive drab, unarmed, their hands in various attitudes of submission and resignation, watching the German column continue its westward surge. Some of them, in the logic of men who have survived the first shock of capture and are beginning to reconstruct normalcy from chaos, may have begun to calculate. They were prisoners. There were rules. The Geneva Convention existed. The war would end. These things would be adjudicated. Lieutenant Iams, standing near Sergeant Zack in the field, understood German. He had been listening to the voices of the SS men around the perimeter. He turned to Zack and spoke quietly. His words were not a calculation of survival. They were a verdict. "Zack," he said, "they're going to kill us." What followed took, by the most careful reconstruction of survivor testimony and forensic evidence, approximately 12 to 15 minutes. 2 German half-tracks, each mounted with heavy machine guns, positioned themselves at the perimeter of the field. The prisoners were standing in rough rows, 4 deep. More than 100 men packed in the small space between the cafe ruins and the fence line. At approximately 14:15 hours, 2 pistol shots rang out from the direction of the German vehicles. Then the machine guns opened fire. The sound, to those standing at the back of the group as Sergeant Zack was not clean or precise. It was a tearing, a hammering, a physical presence that moved through the air and through the bodies of men with the same mechanical indifference. The bodies of the Americans in front of Zach began to fall backward, blown by the force of the rounds, collapsing onto those behind them, pressing backward in a wave of the dead and the dying. Zach went down. He went down into the mud and the blood and the weight of his comrades' bodies, and he lay still. The firing continued long after it was needed, long after any rational military calculus would have demanded it. It continued the way cruelty continues, past its purpose, beyond its function, into the territory where it becomes something else entirely. When the guns paused, German soldiers moved into the field on foot. They moved methodically. They kicked. They prodded. They listened for breathing. Those who moved, those who groaned, those who could not maintain the absolute stillness of death, they were shot at close range in the head. Autopsies performed in January 1945 by American doctors at the 44th Evacuation Hospital would confirm what the survivors already knew. 43 of the bodies recovered at Bognez had been shot execution-style in the head, at close range, after the initial volley. 43 separate, deliberate, point-blank decisions. A German soldier stood next to Sergeant Zach. Zach heard the boot come down against his lower body. He did not move. He was lying face down in the mud, pressed against the earth, pressed against the bodies of men he had known and served alongside. The soldier beside him fired. Second Lieutenant Lloyd A. Iams of California, who had spoken just enough German to understand what was coming, fell and his body touched Zach's feet. Then the column moved on. The last elements of Kampfgruppe paper continued west toward the Meuse. The crossroads fell quiet. The smoke from the burning cafe and barn drifted low over the field. The temperature continued to drop. What the SS had believed in those 12 to 15 minutes was this: that the problem had been solved, that the inconvenience of 113 American prisoners, in a narrow salient where there were no roads leading safely to the rear, where American combat units might arrive at any moment from Malmedy to the north, had been resolved with the same efficiency that Kampfgruppe paper applied to all tactical problems, that the field at Bognez was now simply a field of the dead, and the dead do not testify. This belief was the most consequential error Joachim paper ever made, because the dead were not all dead. Over the course of the afternoon, as German vehicles continued to roll past on the N-23, some of them raking the field with machine gun fire, some of their crews taking individual shots at the shapes in the mud. 61 Americans who had survived the initial volley lay in the frost and the blood and waited. They waited with the patience of men who have been forced to understand, in the most direct way possible, what patience costs. Some were wounded. Some were bleeding in ways that would eventually kill them. Sergeant Zach had taken a bullet in the hip sometime in the late afternoon, as a German half-track raked the field for what he later counted as the third or fourth time. He lay still. He breathed in the smallest increments he could manage. He smelled the smoke of the burning roadhouse. He listened to the sound of the column passing, the steel and the diesel and the grinding of frozen ground under tank tracks. As darkness settled over the Ardennes, the early, abrupt darkness of a December evening at 50 degrees north latitude, Zach began to move. He pushed himself backward with his hands and one leg, dragging his shattered leg behind him, moving in inches toward the burned shell of the roadhouse. He pushed pieces of corrugated steel against a fallen beam and crawled underneath. He covered himself. He was not thinking of warmth. He was thinking of being hidden. He spent the night there, through the dark hours of December 17th and into the morning of December 18th, while the Battle of the Bulge raged in all directions around him, while American and German armies collided and collided again across the frozen Ardennes. Sergeant Roy Zach of Burnett County, Wisconsin, lay bleeding under a sheet of corrugated steel in the ruins of a Belgian roadside cafe and did not die. It was not heroism that kept him alive in the conventional sense. It was the unglamorous, animal determination to simply continue existing in the face of everything that had been organized to prevent it. The following afternoon, he heard voices. He called out. An American captain and 2 enlisted men in a command and reconnaissance car heard him and found him. They drove him to Malmedy. There, doctors administered plasma, the field version, reconstituted from powder and water, 3 units of it, as fast as it could go in. Zach later remembered feeling the warmth returning to his body, like a tide coming in. He was back, he said. He was ready to go back to the front. The doctor told him his war was over. In the days and weeks that followed, the survivors of Bognez, approximately 40 men, made it to American lines by various routes, through various acts of endurance that no subsequent account can fully measure, became the first witnesses to what would be named the Malmedy Massacre. Lieutenant Colonel Pergrin had already sent his report to 1st Army Headquarters on the evening of the 17th. 21 survivors gave sworn statements in Malmedy on December 17th and 18th themselves, still shaking, still bleeding in some cases, but speaking with a consistency and clarity that would hold up against every subsequent attempt at challenge or revision. They all told, in its essentials, the same story. The Germans assembled them, disarmed them, and then shot them. Without warning, without cause, without the legal or moral architecture that even the most exhausted civilization had constructed to distinguish war from murder. The word spread through the Allied command with the speed that atrocity always travels, faster than good news, faster than tactical reports, faster than almost anything. It reached the 30th Infantry Division, which was fighting its way back toward Malmedy. It reached 1st Army Headquarters. It reached the War Department in Washington. By the time the Associated Press correspondent Hal Boyle published his account in Stars and Stripes in early January 1945, under the headline Nazis Turn Machine Guns on GI POWs, the Malmedy Massacre had become something larger than a single tactical crime. It had become a symbol. It had become, in the vocabulary of the war, an answer to a question that some Americans had still been struggling to fully answer. What, precisely, was the enemy capable of? What was the nature of the thing America was fighting? To understand why this question still had to be answered in December 1944 requires understanding what the Waffen-SS had built its identity upon, and what it expected the war to be. The SS soldier and Kampfgruppe was among the most decorated and ideologically committed formations in the entire German order of battle, had been educated since early adolescence in a particular cosmology. It was a cosmology in which nations were organisms locked in biological competition, in which weakness was a biological defect to be eliminated, in which the enemy was not a man with a family and a hometown and a tin of cigarettes in his breast pocket, but a problem to be solved. The Eastern Front had reinforced this education in fire and blood. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht and the SS had conducted a war of annihilation against an enemy they had spent years dehumanizing, and the habits formed in that environment, the reflexive contempt for prisoners, the casual efficiency of mass killing, traveled west with the men who had learned them. What the SS expected at Bognez, in the deepest logic of its own training and ideology, was silence. Permanent, uncontested silence. 113 men, removed from the equation. Problem solved. Column moves west. What it got instead was testimony. The bodies of the American soldiers who had died at the Bognez crossroads lay in the field through the rest of December and most of January, locked under the snow and ice of one of the harshest Belgian winters in memory, while the Battle of the Bulge burned itself out around them. On January 14th, 1945, when the 30th Infantry Division retook the area and engineers swept the field for mines, they found 71 bodies, frozen solid, fully clothed, and on most of them, still there in pockets and kit bags, somehow untouched, were the ordinary belongings of American soldiers. Rings, photographs, letters from home. The Germans had taken the cigarettes, but they had not taken everything. The dead had kept their small dignities. American Army doctors at the 44th Evacuation Hospital performed autopsies on the recovered bodies over 3 days in January. The reports they wrote were clinical, precise, and deeply disturbing to read even now. They documented what the surviving testimony had already established, that the men at Bognez had not died in a firefight, or in an ambush, or in any of the contexts that war provides for killing with some semblance of legitimacy. They had been shot while standing as prisoners in a field, and then shot again on the ground. The evidence was in the angle of the entry wounds, in the proximity of the powder burns, in the pattern of impact across bodies that had not been running or fighting when the bullets found them. The reports were entered into evidence. It was while this evidence was being gathered that another story was unfolding in a different corner of the dying Third Reich, one that, in its own way, illuminated the same truth from a different angle. In the spring of 1945, in a small German village near Stuttgart, a young lieutenant named Earl Koch Jr. of Dawson, Georgia, was about to be shot. Koch had already been wounded 3 times before this moment. He had been stabbed in the right hand by a Gestapo agent. A sniper had taken his left hand. A ricochet had grazed his skull. He had been captured by the Germans 3 times and had escaped 3 times. Once by disguising himself as a French laborer and pushing a wheelbarrow 150 miles through occupied territory before he was found. He had spent, by his own account, 87 consecutive days in combat. He was a G3 intelligence officer, a man whose job was to slip into villages ahead of the Allied advance and alert the French underground, which made him, in German eyes, among the most valuable and the most despised of American soldiers. A spy, an informant, a man who moved between worlds and therefore belonged, in the German accounting, to no protected category. On April 24, 1945, 2 weeks before Germany's unconditional surrender, Koch and a group of 18 other escaped prisoners had done something extraordinary. They had seized control of a bridge in a small town near Stuttgart. The bridge was critical to the German withdrawal, one of the last viable crossing points for the retreating Wehrmacht in that sector. Koch and his men had blocked it with tractors, taken superior firing positions, and in a firefight that lasted long enough to become legendary in their own small circle, killed more than 80 German soldiers and captured hundreds more. They held the bridge against a force that vastly outnumbered them. Then the main German column arrived, a force large enough that no calculation of courage or positioning could compensate for the raw disparity in numbers. Koch and his group were surrounded, disarmed, and briefly interrogated. The Germans were not in a generous mood. They had just lost a bridge, lost 80 men, lost hundreds of prisoners. They had 4 weeks of war left, though they did not yet know this. What they knew was that they had a small group of American soldiers who had inflicted a serious tactical defeat on a withdrawing army. They lined them up. Earl Koch Jr. stood in the line and waited. He did not know what Sergeant Roy Zack had learned in that Belgian field the previous December. He did not know about the field at Bognes, or the 61 survivors, or the sworn testimonies, or the reports being assembled at the 44th Evacuation Hospital. He stood in line and listened to the commands being given in German around him, and he understood enough to know what was coming. The volley came. Koch was hit 4 times, twice in the stomach, once between the ribs, once in the back above the kidneys. He fell into the pile of bodies around him. His lung began to bleed. His left arm went temporarily numb as the bleeding pressed on the nerves. He lay among the dead and did not die. The German unit moved on. The village went quiet. The war continued for 2 more weeks, burning itself down from the outside in, state by state, city by city, until nothing was left of the Third Reich but the paperwork of surrender. The villagers who found Earl Koch Jr., ordinary German civilians, cleaning up their town in the wake of the retreating army, found him breathing among the bodies. They took him to an aid station. A doctor sewed up his stomach with silk thread. He would undergo 17 more operations in the following 14 months. He would survive all of them. He would go on to become, at the age of 29, the youngest national commander in the history of the American Legion. He would testify before Congress on Veterans Affairs, sell war bonds from a stretcher, counsel returning soldiers through their readjustment crises at Harvard Business School, and when asked in his later years how he had survived 4 bullets at close range in the abdomen, he answered with the particular honesty of men who have been forced to confront their own survival. I have no more idea how I survived than do the many well-wishers who ask me. The German soldiers who shot him were never identified. In the chaos of the final weeks of the European War, in the vast dissolution of the Wehrmacht's command structure, the execution at that bridge near Stuttgart was one incident among thousands, too small to be recorded in any official history, too large to be forgotten by the man who survived it. But Malmedy was different. Malmedy had witnesses. Malmedy had autopsies. Malmedy had 21 sworn statements taken within 24 hours of the event, before any collusion or contamination was possible. Malmedy had the body of 2nd Lieutenant Lloyd A. Iams of California, who had understood enough German to hear his own death sentence pronounced, and had chosen to say nothing except to warn the man standing next to him, and whose body was found exactly where Sergeant Zach had described it, near where Zach had been lying, in the field at Bognes. In May 1946, 74 members of Kampfgruppe Paper were arraigned before a United States military court in the former concentration camp at Dachau, Germany. Among the defendants was Joachim Paper himself, still only 31 years old, still carrying himself with the bearing of a man who had spent his entire adult life in uniform. They were charged with willfully permitting, encouraging, aiding, abetting, and participating in the killing, shooting, ill treatment, abuse, and torture of members of the United States Armed Forces. All 74 were found guilty. 43, including Paper, were sentenced to death. None of the death sentences was carried out. Through a combination of legal challenges, accusations of coercion in obtaining confessions, the political complexities of the early Cold War, in which a rearmed West Germany was becoming a strategic necessity and former SS officers a useful intelligence resource, all of the Malmedy defendants had been released from prison by Christmas 1956. Paper was the last to leave. He would die in 1976 in a farmhouse in France, when the house burned to the ground in what many believed was an act of deliberate arson by former French resistance members who had longer memories than the diplomatic machinery of post-war Europe. The justice that emerged from Malmedy was imperfect. Historians have noted correctly that the investigation was flawed, that some of the confessions were obtained under duress, that the trials served political purposes that complicated their legal integrity. These are honest criticisms of an honest failure, but they do not diminish what the survivors of Bognes had made possible. They do not diminish the 21 statements taken on December 17th and 18th, 1944, by men still bleeding and still shaking with cold. They do not diminish Sergeant Roy Zach, who lay under a sheet of corrugated steel in the Belgian winter with a shattered hip and a bullet in his body, and refused to do the one thing the SS had needed him to do. He refused to disappear. In the autumn of 1944, in the occupied French city of Belfort, a fireman named Georges Blind had also refused to disappear, in a different way, by a different method, but with the same fundamental refusal at its core. Blind had been arrested by the Gestapo for his membership in the French resistance. He had been interrogated. He had said nothing. The Gestapo, in the way of organizations built on the confidence that fear is the master key of human behavior, had then organized a demonstration, a staged firing squad, rifles raised, the geometry of death fully assembled, everything present except the actual intention to fire. They wanted information. They believed that a man who had not broken under interrogation would break under this. Georges Blind stood in front of the raised rifles and smiled. Not the smile of a man performing bravery for an audience. Not a political gesture. Not a statement intended for history. Something more intimate than that. A smile that came from somewhere the Gestapo had not found in all its interrogations, from some internal room that neither rifles nor threats could enter. The photograph taken that day by a German camera for German purposes, in the service of German power. That photograph survived the war and survived the silence that followed the war, and it shows what the Gestapo's demonstration was ultimately unable to show, that there exists in the architecture of a human person a space that no occupying force can fully occupy. Blind was not executed that day. He was sent to Dachau, where he died sometime in the winter of 1944. The exact date is not recorded, but the photograph remains, and in it he is still standing, still smiling, still present in a way that the rifles around him were never able to resolve. These stories, Bognes and Belfort, Wisconsin and Georgia and Greece, are not separate stories. They are the same story told from different angles, in different languages, on different soils. They are the story of what happens when a system built on the certainty of its own power encounters the one variable it cannot account for, the individual human being who simply will not comply with the narrative of their own erasure. On May 1st, 1944, in the Athens suburb of Kaiseriani, 200 Greek communist resistance fighters were marched onto a military firing range and shot in batches of 15, on the orders of Nazi occupation authorities, in retaliation for the killing of a German general 4 days earlier. They marched with their heads up, according to witnesses on surrounding hillsides. One man had carved a message into his wooden leg, a message to his widowed mother, telling her that he was dying for Greece. As the 4 vans carried the bodies away, blood flowed through the streets in the accounts of those who watched from windows and doorways. Nazi soldiers fired at the women who threw flowers onto the blood in the road. In the mass graves where the bodies were taken, the undertakers heard groans. Some of those who had survived the firing squad were still alive when they were lowered into the earth. They were buried anyway, in the hurry of men under the guns of an army that had no patience for the complication of survival. But the witnesses remained. Giorgio Sideris, who watched from the neighboring hill, remained. Ioanna Tsatsu, the Greek writer who later became the first lady of her nation, remained. The undertakers who heard the groans remained. Their testimony was written down. The truth of Kaiseriani was preserved in the same way that all truths from the occupied world were preserved, in the memories of people who had every reason to go silent and chose, instead, to speak. What the architects of these events, paper, the SS command structure, the Nazi occupation authorities in Athens, had counted on was the permanent silencing of the witness. What they had underestimated was the particular stubbornness of memory in those who have seen the worst. The human need to say, "I was there. This happened. I will not let it vanish." There is something that runs through every one of these accounts, something that the documents and testimony and autopsy reports can point to but cannot quite contain. It is the cigarettes. When the German soldiers searched the Battery B prisoners at the Bognes crossroads, before the machine guns, before the field, before the bodies in the snow, they took the cigarettes. They reached into breast pockets and jacket flaps and extracted those small, ordinary items with the practiced efficiency of men who had learned that nothing belonging to a prisoner needed to remain with the prisoner. It was a gesture of total possession, the assertion that even the smallest comforts of the conquered belonged, now, to the conqueror. The cigarette is a small thing. In the American military of World War II, it was issued by the government as a standard provision, as reliable as rations and ammunition. Every C ration pack contained 4 cigarettes. Every K ration included a small waterproof packet of 2 or 3. The Army provided them not because it approved of smoking, but because it understood what soldiers required. A small ceremony of pause in the middle of the unceasing demand of war, a moment in which a man could stop moving, stop calculating, stop bracing, and simply breathe. It was a democratic comfort. It did not distinguish between officers and enlisted men, between the decorated and the obscure, between the man from Georgia and the man from Wisconsin. Everyone got the same cigarette. The Germans took them, and in taking them, they were doing something that went beyond petty theft. They were asserting the grammar of the world they were trying to build, a world in which these men had no rights to comfort, no claim on warmth, no standing to the small dignities that the American government had decided its soldiers deserved. A world in which some lives were simply of less account than others. But the cigarettes were taken after the photographs were taken, after the letters were written, after the sworn statements were committed to paper, after Sergeant Roy Zack had decided, in that field at Bognes, that whatever the Germans believed about the permanence of silence, he was going to be inconvenient about it. The bodies recovered at Bognes in January 1945 still had their rings, still had their photographs, still had, in some cases, their letters. The Germans had taken what was most consumable and left behind what was most durable. In the end, it was the durable things that mattered. It was the durable things that went to Dachau in the spring of 1946. It was the durable things that have survived to be read and taught and reflected upon in every subsequent generation that has tried to understand what was done, and how, and why, and what it cost to stop it. Sergeant Henry Roy Zack of Burnett County, Wisconsin, spent the remainder of his life dealing with a bone infection in the wound he received at Bognes. Every day, for the rest of his life, he bandaged his leg. He did not speak publicly about Malmedy for years. When he finally gave his full oral history to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in 1999, 55 years after the massacre, he remembered details that time had not softened and distance had not blurred. He remembered the sound of the machine guns. He remembered the weight of the bodies falling against him. He remembered the German boot against his lower body, and the absolute stillness he held in that moment. He remembered the body of Lieutenant Iams touching his feet. He died on September 3, 2002. The memorial at the Bognez Crossroads carries 84 names. Some are misspelled. One was mistakenly removed for a period and then restored. The cafe is gone. The field where the men fell is now covered in grass, and in December it is often covered in snow, and the fog still settles low and gray over the Ardennes in winter, the same fog that was there on December 17, 1944, when a column of American vehicles moving in the wrong direction met the most decorated and most pitiless armored formation in the German order of battle. In the end, the 12 minutes at Bognez proved the limits of the proposition that had organized the entire machinery of the Third Reich. The proposition was this: that force, applied with sufficient efficiency and sufficient completeness, could produce permanent silence, that the world could be remade by men willing to work fast enough and cold enough, and without the complication of mercy. What the survivors of Bognez demonstrated, what Sergeant Zach proved by simply continuing to breathe under a sheet of corrugated steel in a Belgian winter night, was that this proposition was wrong. Not wrong in a philosophical sense, wrong in the most practical sense possible. Wrong the way a bridge calculation is wrong when the bridge falls. It didn't hold, because 12 minutes was not enough. 15 minutes was not enough. Not enough to take a field of American soldiers and convert them into silence. Not enough to guarantee that no one would crawl out. Not enough to ensure that no one would find their voice in the dark, call out to the approaching Americans, and say, "I am here. I saw this. I will tell you what I know." It was never going to be enough, because the thing the SS could not confiscate, the thing it took from no one's pocket on that December afternoon, the thing it found no way to remove, was not a cigarette and not a watch and not a letter from home. It was the capacity to endure past the point where endurance had been declared impossible. It was the human insistence, in the face of every organizational effort to eliminate it, on continuing to exist and to speak of what one has seen. Freedom is not a philosophical category in a field at Bognez in December 1944. It is not a flag or a declaration or an architecture of rights enshrined in documents. It is a man lying face down in the mud and the blood of his comrades, under a gray Belgian sky, with a bullet in his hip and the sound of German machine guns still echoing in the frosted air, who has decided, quietly, without witnesses, without any particular reason to believe it will matter, that he is not yet done, that he still has something to say, that the silence they made for him is not his silence. That is what Roy Zach carried out of the field at Bognez. Not a conviction, not a strategy, not a plan. Something simpler than any of those things. A refusal so complete and so ordinary and so profoundly human that no amount of firepower could fully answer it. They lined him up for execution. 12 minutes later, he was still there, and the men who pulled the triggers were gone.